This video is going to be super long, so buckle up. I want to start this video by saying I don't really like the term rape culture. It implies that our culture approves of or tolerates rape and sexual assault, which I don't think is true. Even if that isn't exactly what it means, that's what it implies. And it is an alienating implication that's a conversation stopper, in my opinion, not a conversation starter. And one very common statistic that you hear in defense of the idea of the rape culture is the idea that 1 in 5 women have been raped in their lifetime. And a lot of people quite vehemently claim that this is a bogus, made-up statistic. And I have to admit, it seems pretty crazy to think that 20% of all the women in my life, including friends and family, and then including people I've never met before, that 20% of them have been raped. But like I said before, it starts becoming a little more believable once you start listening to the stories from women. My challenge to you is, if you're brave enough and you can find people that are willing to talk about it, is go and ask the women in your life if they've ever been raped or sexually assaulted. I feel like if you can get people to actually talk to you about it, you'd be shocked at just how many of them have. But of course, anecdotes aren't worth that much. We have to look at the data. And if you formed a strong opinion about this without looking at the data, you're doing it wrong. So let's look at the data. Okay, most people who say that 1 in 5 women have been raped are quoting a 2007 campus sexual assault study, or CSA. And when I say quoting, I mean misquoting, because that study does not conclude that 1 in 5 women have been raped. What it does conclude is that 1 in 5 senior undergraduate women at the 2 universities where the studies took place have been raped or sexually assaulted on campus. So it's a bit more specific, and it's important to be specific. If a study does not actually provide support for the specific claim that you're making, you're not allowed to quote it in your defense. But even so, that's still a startling number. And I think it's fair to suspect that if this is happening at these 2 universities, it might be happening at other universities and maybe elsewhere. But a lot of people have issues with the methodology and conclusion of this study. In my view, however, none of those issues are legitimate. So let's talk about that. The Independent Women's Forum, or IWF, which for time's sake is basically an anti-feminist group made up mostly of women, maybe solely of women, I'm not sure. They held a panel last year where they discussed and disputed the 1 in 5 statistic. One of the issues they raised was related to how the study defined sexual assault. For example, they implied that the study defined sex while under the influence of drugs or alcohol as sexual assault. At the panel, Sabrina Schaefer, executive director of the IWF, wrote this: "Proponents of the 1 in 5 statistic are exaggerating the threat, too often confusing regretful sexual decisions made while under the influence of alcohol or drugs with actual rape." Assuming that Schaefer and her colleagues actually read the study, this is straight up intellectual dishonesty, because the CSA study clearly defines sexual assault with regard to drugs and alcohol. Legal definitions of sexual assault factor in one's ability to provide consent, and individuals who are incapacitated because of the effects of alcohol or drugs are incapable of consenting. In the CSA study, we consider as incapacitated sexual assault any unwanted sexual contact occurring when a victim is unable to provide consent or stop what is happening because she is passed out, drugged, drunk, incapacitated, or asleep, regardless of whether the perpetrator was responsible for her substance abuse or whether substances were administered without her knowledge. So this is clearly not regrettable sexual decisions. These are situations in which a victim is unable to provide consent or stop what is happening. The study clearly says that. Sometimes when you're drunk, you're able to provide consent or stop what is happening, and sometimes you're not. And when you're not, it's rape. And those are the situations that are measured by this study. At the panel, Christina Hoff Sommers, writer for the IWF and well-known critic of mainstream feminism, said, "If sexual intimacy under the influence of alcohol is by definition assault, then I would say a significant percentage of sexual intercourse throughout the world and down the ages would qualify as a crime." And once again, this is like an intentional straw man. I mean, maybe some crazy people define sexual assault that way, but no legitimate study, including the CSA, has ever defined sexual assault that way. Other people have claimed that these studies include things like touching someone's hand or verbal harassment as examples of rape and sexual assault. And again, this is factually incorrect. Now, many of these studies, including the CSA, do collect data on these things, but they're always counted in separate categories. You know, you can actually go on the internet and read these studies. This is why I'm led to believe that this is intentional dishonesty. According to a piece written for Time by Christopher Krebs and Christine Lindquist, 2 of the people who directed the CSA study, among other items, the students were asked these 2 key questions. Since you began college, has anyone had sexual contact with you using physical force or threatening to physically harm you? And Since you began college, has someone had sexual contact with you when you were unable to provide consent or stop what was happening because you were passed out, drugged, drunk, incapacitated, or asleep? This question asks about incidents that you are certain happened. To be counted as a victim of sexual assault or rape and included in the 1 in 5 statistic, a woman would have to be a senior and answer yes to one or both of those questions. Notice how it says among other items at the beginning of that quote. Those 2 questions were not the only thing that the respondents were asked, but those were the questions that you had to have answered yes to in order to be considered a victim of sexual assault. So the implication that some people, including my friend Skeptor, have made that the CSA study includes things like verbal harassment or grazing someone's hand as sexual assault are utterly completely false. Another problem people have with the CSA study is its low response rate. Response rate, quite simply, is the percentage of people that responded to a survey compared to the entire sample. The idea here is that low response rates can lead to what is called a non-response bias, which means that there could be some unifying reason that the people who didn't respond didn't. For example, imagine if a business surveys 1,000 workers to ask them if they feel that they work too many hours, but only 500 people respond. That's a 50% response rate. It's middle of the road, not too good, not too bad. And then say of those 500 people, 90% of them were like, nah, my hours are fine, it's okay. That business may be like, well, that's 90%. That's pretty good statistic. I'm not going to cut any hours. However, it could be the case that the reason the other 500 people did not respond is because they worked too much and they had no time or they were too tired. So if they were to respond, it would drastically change the outcome of the survey. That's non-response bias. So the response rate for the CSA study was about 42%. Christina Hoff-Sommers said, the people who feel the most strongly about the survey for whatever reason are the most likely to respond. So let me lay this out for you. Response rate is the go-to cherry that opponents of any given study pick when they can't dispute the actual content of the study. And while non-response bias is a thing, it should by no means be assumed to be happening every time a response rate is low. You don't just throw out a study when it has a low response rate. That's not how this works. That's inefficient, impractical, and intellectually lazy. Especially considering the fact that several studies have been done that conclude that response rate is not a significant factor in survey accuracy. People who say that surveys with low response rates have inherently less accurate results than surveys with high response rates don't know what they're talking about. It's not true. As long as a study is done efficiently and properly, its results should not be ignored. So yeah, it's possible that the people who felt the most strongly about this survey were the most likely to respond. But you don't get to just assume that without any evidence. First of all, in any properly done survey, the sample size is specifically chosen according to the projected response rate. And this was the case for the CSA, by the way. Further, as Krebs and Lindquist note, we conducted an analysis of this non-response rate and found that respondents were not significantly different from non-respondents in terms of age, race, ethnicity, or year of study. Given the sensitive nature of the questions, the anonymity and privacy we afforded respondents may have made women comfortable with responding honestly. Overall, we believe that the trade-offs associated with low response rates were overcome by the benefits of cost efficiency and data quality. So of course, there's no real way to know for sure how the non-response bias affected the survey. But if after an analysis of the sample, we have literally no reason to assume that the data is inaccurate, doing so is nothing more than unfounded incredulity. Now, it's worth mentioning that the following was added to the Krebs and Lindquist article. Although we used the best methodology available to us at the time, there are caveats that make it inappropriate to use the 1 in 5 number in the way it's being used today as a baseline or the only statistic when discussing our country's problem with rape and sexual assault on campus. And I think this is fair. Once again, this is a very specific study and it's only one study. You should try to find other sources of data that correlate with and support this data, like maybe the National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence Survey, or NISVS, the most recent of which was published in 2014. The NISVS concluded quite similarly that 1 in 5 women have been raped in their lifetime. And this study includes women in general, not just women in college, although it does show that the age of victimization is more likely to be college age. Now, people have the same problems with the NISVS that they do with the CSA, and they're just as non-legitimate for the exact same reasons. The NISVS, for example, has a particularly low response rate, but as we've learned, that doesn't matter nearly as as much as they want you to think it does. It's also useful to note the difference between response rate and cooperation rate. Response rate is the percentage of the entire sample of people that answered the survey. Cooperation rate is the percentage of people who were actually physically asked to take the survey that actually did. And the NISVS actually has a pretty high cooperation rate in the 80% range. The go-to study for people that refuse to believe the 1 in 5 statistic is the National Crime Victimization Survey, or NCVS, mad acronyms, also most recently published in 2014. This study concludes that roughly 2.5% of women have been a victim of rape or sexual assault in their lives. Obviously, a much lower number than the 20% we get from the other surveys. Another bonus for this camp is that the NCVS has a particularly high response rate, somewhere in the 80% range. But again, the idea that response rate determines how accurate the data is going to be is unsubstantiated, and as far as we know, probably flat out incorrect. So why did this survey come out with such a different number than the other ones? Well, luckily for us, they actually tell us in the text of the study. The NCVS is presented as a survey about crime, while the NISVS and CSA are presented as surveys about public health. The NISVS and CSA collect data on incidents of unwanted sexual contact that may not rise to a level of criminal behavior, and respondents may not report incidents to the NCVS that they do not consider to be criminal. So the NCVS is a crime study. So imagine a woman's walking down the street and some stranger pops out and fondles her. Is that a crime? Well, in many places it probably is a crime. In some places it may not be a crime. The woman herself may not consider it a crime, so she may not report it to the survey, which was presented to her as a crime survey. And if the people conducting the survey don't see it as a crime, then they wouldn't add it to their data. Also this, I won't read this verbatim, you can pause the screen and read it yourself, but this section literally says that the NCVS uses a more narrow definition of sexual assault. For example, it doesn't include sexual assault of people who are incapacitated due to alcohol or drug intoxication. Why doesn't it? That clearly counts. That doesn't mean that this study is useless, it just means that this study has a different scope and different goals than the other ones. But it's disingenuous to say that this study provides more accurate data than the other ones. This is nothing more than people arbitrarily choosing the study that seems to confirm their bias. So I think the main thing we have to realize is that there is a spectrum of rape and sexual assault, and it can occur to varying degrees. I think a lot of times we hear the word rape and we automatically think of violent Ted Bundy style shit. And I think that's what makes the 1 in 5 number seem so unbelievable to people. Now obviously that happens, but does that happen to 20% of women? Probably not. But sexual assault includes a lot of things, and it's important to understand that. It doesn't have to include penetration. It doesn't even have to include genitals. It doesn't have to be a stranger. It could be your spouse or your boyfriend or your neighbor. It can happen during consensual sex. It can happen in public. It can happen with your clothes on. And in my opinion, when you take that into account, 1 in 5 doesn't seem like that much of a stretch. Now, obviously, some of these things are more or less traumatic than some of the other things. But that doesn't change the fact that they're sexual assault and that they happen way too often and that they shouldn't happen, that we should care and we should try to fix it. Remember the ice bucket challenge last year for people with ALS? Fun fact, about 1 in 50,000 people have ALS. And we managed to come together as a community and raise awareness and a lot of money for something that's actually a problem. Now, obviously, some people just did it for attention, but the point is, people cared and we came together and we actually did something good. Now, way more people than that have been victims of rape and sexual assault. But instead of coming together to fight this problem, we're using it to separate ourselves and further our own agendas, leaving the people that need our support high and dry. So, have 1 in 5 women been raped or sexually assaulted? Probably, yeah. The best data we have leans towards that number. But what you should care about is that number, whatever it is way too high. And we should stop bickering and do something about it. That's just me though. Please drop a comment, continue the discussion below. I want to give a shout out to all of the new subscribers. How you doing? If you like the video, please press the thumbs up button and subscribe if you like my hair. Hillary Clinton seemed to be the most comfortable there, which makes sense because she's the only one that's really done this before. She's also the person that Anderson Cooper seemed to pick on the most.
Do you change your political identity based on who you're talking to?
Damn, Anderson. A lot of people accuse Hillary Clinton of changing her stances when it's politically convenient to do so, which maybe she does, but if she's changing from bad stances to good stances, then that's what we want.